and then which has also been held back by the pandemic and then by the rise in interest rates. That also acts as a drag on growth going forward. And then also we've seen, like every other country in the advanced world, we've seen slow productivity growth really since the financial crisis, which has grown at around half its pre-financial crisis rate. In the budget, the Chancellor did take action on some of those structural weaknesses, most notably the package of measures he put together on trying to bring people back into the labour force. We estimate that taken together, the policies he introduced to bring in free childcare for parents of young children, as well as measures to encourage pensioners to stay in the labour force, as well as bring people on benefits into the labour force, raise employment by around 110,000. Now that's only a fraction of what we think we've lost since the pandemic, but we think it does make some contribution to employment growth over the period. There are some temporary tax breaks for business investment, and I'm sure we'll get into the merits and demerits of their time frame, but we do think that boosts investment in the near term, but it doesn't do so for the long term because they expire in March of 2026. But in the end, he spends about 2/3 of what was a £25 billion windfall, annual windfall that he got through our forecast from a slightly stronger economy, and it left him just about meeting his target for getting debt to start falling in 5 years' time. But he does it with the smallest margin any Chancellor has ever had against their fiscal rules, so long as the OBR has been around, only £6.5 billion in the final year. So debt is only falling by 0.2% of GDP in the final year of the forecast, which is a very narrow margin to get debt falling when one bears in mind that we have a debt to GDP ratio of 100% of GDP, and not so long ago it was down at 30% of GDP. So it's risen a lot, and it is falling by a very small amount at the end of the forecast period as a result of the measures introduced by the Chancellor. And it's also fair to say that there were sort of more than the usual number of kind of fiscal illusions in this set of fiscal forecasts, including the fact that the Chancellor's insisting, like all of his predecessors, that he's going to raise fuel duty by RPI inflation. No Chancellor's done that since 2011. If he doesn't do that, he loses between £3 and £4 billion. Also, that while the tax incentives for business are deemed to be temporary, he says he wants to make them permanent. Once when the fiscal position allows. At the moment, that would cost him £10 billion. So that was one of the reasons why he didn't go ahead with them. And also, one has to bear in mind that the public spending plans that underpin our forecast beyond the current spending review period, so from 2024-25 onwards, assume that current spending only grows by 0.9% in real terms, and that investment spending is actually frozen in cash terms over the remainder of the forecast period, and that means that public investment spending is falling from from 3% of GDP down to 2% of GDP over that period, which is one of the things which actually contributes to the drag on growth as you get out toward the back end of the forecast and beyond. So that's an overview of the economic forecast, the fiscal forecast, what's in it, but also what's not in it. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, John.
Not having said that earlier. Anyway, Matt. Yeah, I think that's.
Okay, so I will open by just reminding us maybe of the top 5 most notable tax measures. There's always a lot in that red book when it comes out, and us tax experts are flicking through hundreds of pages trying to work out what really matters. So just as a reminder, the most notable were that pensions lifetime allowance being abolished and the tax-free savings amounts. There was the 100% capital allowances, now known as full expensing. The R&D cash credit was improved for SMEs. There was investment zones announced, and there was also 140 million for the TV and film industry. But I think it's really important not to just look at this spring budget alone. We have to take it together with the autumn statement announcements. And in there was some really good news, which I think has been underreported, which is the research and development expenditure credit. We're going to start talking a bit more about that. That goes up from 13% to 20% and should significantly incentivise R&D by big corporates. However, that was the extent of the good news, to be honest. So there was a big curtailment of the SME R&D benefits at the time. So this budget sounded like good news, but it only partly reversed what was cut in the autumn. And of course, there were 2 really big tax rises, the corporate tax rate going up to 25%, and all of those freezes on allowances continued, thresholds cut. which led to the biggest fiscal drag we've ever seen. So, and that is starting to take effect. All these measures taking effect now in April. I was interested, Richard, you referred to a time period going back to the Second World War, because we are now facing, and many commentators have noted this, the highest tax burden since the Second World War. From this tax year, we'll end up at 37% GDP, proportion of tax to GDP, 37%, which is 5% higher than we were pre-pandemic. If you like numbers, we've looked at the OBR's forecast, and it looks like in the tax year 25-26, the government is going to be taking over £1 trillion in tax revenue for the first time. That's a really big number, and is the big thing leading to tax takes. So I think it's really important as well to look at this tax burden in competitiveness terms. Obviously, the UK is going to be less competitive from a tax perspective as a result of the rises, although it is true that we do remain the lowest in the G7. I do think it's important, though, to look at our near neighbours, not just the G7. And, for instance, Ireland now has a tax rate that is half ours. So, just to end, was this a budget for growth? I do think there is some good news in that, in the R&D incentives that the government's trying to do. There were some big numbers. There was 20 billion announced for carbon capture, which we are really looking forward to the details of. But we've got to look at the international environment, and it's what other countries are doing here. The US really has entered that race for investment with its Inflation Reduction Act, I'm sure you know about. But really that's a lot of billions of dollars that is attracting businesses' attention now. And of course, as you mentioned, what's unfolding in the banking sector could well affect confidence and therefore investment and availability of lending. So we'll have to see.
Well, thank you, Amanda. Unfortunately, my
Thank you very much. Sorry, my mic isn't working. That very useful, and all maps onto quite a lot of what we've said at the CPS. I was struck by the fact we actually, I think we were the first to produce a briefing pointing out that the state was about to start spending $1 trillion, and it's nice that it's only but it's also symptomatic. It's only taken sort of 2 or 3 years for it to start taxing £1 trillion, sorry, £1 trillion as well. But Kitty, it's all sounding terribly optimistic so far. Surely the IOD can offer a ray of sunshine.
I'll do my best. Thank you very much. Really, really nice to be here, and well done for organising such a timely event with such excellent speakers, myself excluded, obviously, from that. So I am the Chief Economist at the Institute of Directors. What I think might be most useful for these opening remarks is just to say a little bit about what business is looking for and how we've interpreted the budget. So the IOD represents the kind of mid-market of British businesses. We have 20,000 members. We have a Royal Charter to promote entrepreneurialism in the economy. And those members are probably anything from a self-employed consultant through to turnover of perhaps a small number of hundreds of millions. So less likely to be listed, maybe some listed on AIM, and most are kind of in the centre of that. So how business is feeling at the moment? Well, the good news is that confidence is rising. The bad news is it was so bad to start with that we still have more members pessimistic than optimistic about the future of the UK economy last time we asked, which was a couple of weeks ago, just before the budget. Business is now as worried as they were during the Omicron outbreak, which I will remind you was the end of 2021 when Christmas got unofficially cancelled as opposed to being officially cancelled the previous year. All of the negativity from the invasion of Ukraine seems to have worked its way through the system, and confidence is pointing upwards. What they're worried about, in order, is A, the UK economy, broadly speaking, B, skills shortages, C, energy prices, and all of those are quite closely grouped together. So, as a result of all that, they are not wanting to invest, because why would you invest your hard-earned profits or take on more debt when interest rates are rising, or ask investors to risk their own capital when you think it could get wiped out due to factors beyond your control. It's just common sense not to. So it's been a sense of waiting for the crisis to pass, and that's been going on since about 2016. So we have a sort of under-investment situation, as Richard explained. Now, there's a correlation in our data between how confident people are feeling and their investment plans. So I say this to the Treasury: what we have to do is change the mood and stop messing it up, please, and then we get confidence back, and then people will start to invest. So if that's the background, how do we respond to the budget? Well, obviously, it is hugely good news that the tax system has been altered to incentivise that very investment that is lacking. Our view is that when the climate is uncertain, policy needs to work harder, and they seem to have got that message. We were pushing really hard for it, and credit to the CBI as well, who really pushed on 100% expensing. So that's good news. Really good just generally for the fact that the forecasts are upgraded, because that gives you a sense that perhaps the future may be better. That's not a policy decision, but it's a good news coming out of the budget. And yes, if you're in an R&D intensive sector, really good that part of the cuts that were announced in the autumn are being reversed. So our own childcare also, insofar as it increases labour supply and so makes the skills shortages less intense, also great. Even if you're not a parent yourself, if you employ people, chances are you'll employ parents or future parents, so that is all welcome. So the two main caveats to that are, first of all, as Richard alluded to, the fact that 100% expensing is announced as a 3 years only, though we'd love to do it for longer, policy. And this makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, because in fact, without getting too technical, 100% expensing is actually about changing the phasing of receipts. It's not, once you're into the new equilibrium of 100% expensing, it doesn't actually cost the government anything. It just provides more incentives to invest, and so therefore increases culture of innovation in smaller companies. Again, doesn't make any sense. And I think they're worried about fraud, but that's a separate point, we would argue. So looking to the future, the good news is that our data at the moment seems to be pointing upwards. We've got a poll in the field at the moment about order books, and it's looking relatively strong. I'm not seeing in our data a recession, actually. I am seeing quite sticky inflation expectations. So as a macroeconomist, I would say even though your forecasts have been upgraded, perhaps you'll end up upgrading them a little bit more from the data that we have, which is really good news. Less good for the government if inflation's a bit stickier and interest rates go up more, so they can't afford to pay their debt. So I hope that cheers you up a little bit. What I think is unclear is if the jitters in the financial markets sort of break through to the real economy in terms of confidence. I think as of now that probably hasn't happened. We probably need to wait a little bit longer to see if there's a sort of sense that we're in another crisis again. But at the moment this feels like an FT story that's mainly abroad. So that's certainly one to watch. So in summary, not too bad, I would say.
Okay, and now I'll find out whether Doug shares that view.
First of all, thank you very much for organising this, Robert. And thank you also for your pre-budget research, because you've done as much as any to look into the issue of the disappearing labour force and the issues of what the impact of the 1/3 rise in corporate taxes, which starts in April, what that might be. Just before budget day, the last official figures showed GDP nearly 1% lower than it had been pre-pandemic 3 years earlier, and showed on the face of it we were at full employment. Now, if you start from there, you've got two jobs, haven't you, if you're a chancellor? The first is to try and rekindle growth, and the second is to try and make sure that your spending plans fit with what is going on as far as growth is concerned. You can't ultimately spend beyond your revenue. The first of these, rekindling growth, we've had a bit to try and encourage more people into the labour force, pension reforms, reforms to do with health, reforms to do obviously with childcare, that's the biggest single amount, and as Richard says, they should, in theory, bring more than 100,000 people into the labour force. but that is still relatively small. We've lost nearly 500,000 people. As far as getting productivity going is concerned, we've got the full expensing or first-year allowances or whatever you want to call it. The OBR's figures are fairly cautious about that. Mine are actually very slightly more optimistic than the OBR's numbers, but not by much. But neither say very much. And I think one of the reasons is that IT investment is normally expensed anyway. I checked the input-output stats over the weekend, and for 2020, which is obviously pandemic affected, but I don't think the figures are atypical, £63.3 billion of IT investment in software systems and services was expensed, and only £32.5 billion was treated as capex. So you're operating on quite a small base if you're using tax allowances as a way of trying to encourage corporates to invest more. Fundamentally, we have to get productivity up. Now, everyone's saying this, but I think some of the stats are a bit more staggering than is generally accepted. Since the year 2000, productivity per person hour is up 16% in the UK, 17% in France, 21% in Germany, but by 37% in the US. So we're not just falling behind the fast-growing countries in Asia, but also in North America as well. The productivity gap with the US was 7% when Tony Blair became Prime Minister. It's now 21%. And you've seen that in some of the GDP per capita, reflected in some of the GDP per capita figures, which show that the US has now stretched its lead over most of Europe fairly considerably. So that's where we stand on growth. We've got to do something about it. And there was a very good report, which Gordon Brown commissioned back in 1997 by McKinsey, which pointed out that some of the underlying problems in the UK were to do with planning restrictions, were to do with lack of competition and so on. I wish someone would go back and have a little look at that. It was a good report. It didn't sort of fit with the politics of the hour, and it rather got buried. But it is still sitting around in Whitehall, and it might be worth dredging that out. My final point's about public spending. If we're in an economy which is either not growing or growing amazingly slowly, we are going to have another hard look at public spending. There are experimental figures for public sector productivity, and you have to be very careful about using these, but they do seem to show that public sector productivity has dropped dramatically since pre-pandemic. They show the latest data is for a 6.8% fall in public sector productivity. If you compared with the slight upward trend and you extrapolated over public spending, which is maybe a little bit, maybe pushing it a bit, but that's suggesting there's about 70 billion of additional cost that's been built in through loss of productivity, some of which have been clawed back by what's called negative relative price effect, which is paying people in the public sector a bit less. But I don't think that's, in the long term, a great strategy, because if you pay people less, you either lose the staff you want, or else you have problems of other kinds. We've also got the research on benefits and on willingness to work. A lot of that has shown that benefit levels make it hard for many people to make it economic to go and work. Now, it's pretty embarrassing for someone who lives as comfortably as I do to talk about harshness for benefits, but the economic effects exist whether I talk about them or not, so I might as well refer to them. And that's something which is potentially a challenge for us. And of course, the final thing is major projects. Now, Robert's been writing about these, so I'm not the first person, but HS2, what one notices is that the costs go up and the route goes down and the timetable gets longer. It's not even going to go to London now. I'm not quite sure where it is going to go. There was a suggestion it would go to Heathrow, which at least is a place.
It's Old Oak Common, which is better known as Wormwood Scrubs.
It's going to a field. Now, it's useful that it goes to a field because those people who want to reach that field will find a way of getting there. But it may not actually be solving the problem that the country needs. So I think there's a bit to do. It looks to me as if the Chancellor has decided to kick this one into touch. And I think the problem will return to haunt his successor, either the next budget or the budget after that.
Thank you to Doug. So I'm going to start with just keeping the mood of sunny optimism going here. So it's true that the banking crisis it is currently a sort of FT story, but I've already seen things suggesting that that banks might constrict their lending as a result of this. In particular, their mortgage lending. I mean, Richard, you said that the 6.5 billion is already the lowest headroom that's ever been seen by any chancellor. The OBR's reports also contain a slightly ominous disclaimer that if anything else goes wrong, basically, to paraphrase, if anything else goes wrong, we're really in trouble. So you've got very, very thin headroom, very very at risk. You've got the NHS settlement, for example, which is another 2.5 billion, which will apparently be found by efficiency savings. And if anyone in this room believes that, please see me at the drinks afterwards, and I'll pour you a very large one. And something actually specifically for Richard. Deutsche Bank are now pointing out that they say their argument is that the OBR has overstated growth prospects in the medium term by 0.8% on average from 2010 to 2019, which I imagine you would blame on sort of the world rather than your own forecasting abilities. But it doesn't take a lot to see things getting quite crunchy again. So A, is that fair, and B, what can we do about it? I think, Richard, if you're okay to start, but then others can chip in.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that we've been forecasting for the last 3 years in just a very volatile environment, and one in which you first had the pandemic, then you had the energy crisis. These sort of drivers of the economic outlook I've mentioned have jumped around in ways which none of us have really witnessed in our lifetime. Energy prices rising sevenfold and then coming back halfway from that just in the space of the last year are huge changes in one of the key inputs into the productive side of the economy, as well as people's household budgets, which we're all feeling. So big changes in those things which determine our cost of living and also the cost of doing business have big impacts on economic decision making. As I said, as we were heading into putting this forecast together, most of the news was going in the right direction, and that's one of the reasons why our forecast, I think, has ended up being in a more optimistic place than the forecast that came before, because they were just based on higher energy prices and also a higher outlook for interest rates. The news on financial markets is clearly something which we're all keeping an eye on, and it's certainly the case that historically financial shocks, financial instability can be some of the most expensive things that governments have to contend with. But so far, all we can do is watch developments and hope that the reforms that were introduced in the wake of the banking crisis prove to be as effective as they were designed to be. We will be keeping an eye on these things as things unfold.
I should have mentioned there was a very sort of plaintive plea in at the start of your last report saying, we're meant to do 2 of these a year and we've had to do about 6. Guys, please, can you just give a bit of a rest? But it feels like you might not be able to quite get the period of calm that you were. Time will tell. Yeah. If anyone else wants to come in on that aspect.
Shall I just say something very quickly about the financial crisis? First of all, I don't think we need a crisis. I think most of the banking system in this country, and I think even in the States, probably is sufficiently well capitalized for there not to need to be a crisis. I think it is a very different situation since compared with 2008. But as you know, banking crises don't completely follow logic. You know the story in Great Gatsby about how people go bust. They go bust first slowly, then quickly. Well, it's the same with banks. They run out of money relatively slowly. Then when other people see that they're running out of money, everyone crowds in to try and get their money back. And that's the end of the bank. But we don't actually need to have a banking crisis, and it's relatively few institutions, as far as one can see, and I stand to have egg on my face tomorrow morning, that actually look as if they've got holes in the balance sheet in the way that in 2008 there were very many that had them. So with a little bit of luck, we'll get through this. we will need to have liquidity pumped into the banking system. I'm expecting to see that. We'll need to have sensible statements from both the Fed and the Bank of England in the rest of the week, and with a little bit of luck, we'll get through this one, even if the prospects for growth are a little bit clouded by this. And I think some tech companies may find that with SVB shut down, they will find it harder to get money, but they were starting to find it hard to get money anyway.
Cool. Amanda, do you want to come in? Otherwise, I can move on to the next issue, which is so. One of the things we wanted to talk about was investment allowances, which I think everyone's done a pretty good job of covering. And obviously, the rising corporation tax not ideal either. But the other sort of aspect of it was the reforms to inactivity, where as people have said, 500,000 people have left the labour force in various ways and for various reasons, and annoyingly, a lot of them seem to have done so because early retirement seemed quite nice in the pandemic, and there's not really a lot the state can or should do to pull them back. But in your view, did the budget do enough on inactivity?
Thanks. I think what it did do is very positive. I'm not sure it's completely targeted on the issues that have arisen in the last few years. If this is an early retirement amongst a cohort that is quite affluent and noticed during the pandemic that it was more fun not working flat out all of the time, that I'm not seeing much in the budget that would reverse that. However, if you get into the weeds of the Red Book announcements, there are some new work streams that are potentially quite interesting. One example is exploring further extension to sort of flexible working as a kind of right. It already is a day one right, but there was some conversation about perhaps advertising jobs as being more open to part-time working, which anecdotally at least might be of interest if you're a fit and healthy, energised 50-something who, after a couple of years, maybe gets bored with the retirement lark and would like to work 2 days a week. And so I think that's potentially quite interesting. There was also a commitment to put some more resources into a pilot around SME access to occupational health services, which is quite niche. But a smaller business may not have sort of well-established mechanisms for supporting people in work, but the main intervention is obviously around childcare, which will affect a different part of the cohort from the part of the cohort that's been responsible for having less labour supply. Because actually, I think I'm right in saying that one of the effects of the pandemic and the shift to hybrid working is that actually there was already greater participation amongst people with young children. So this is just sort of going with the grain of that rather than addressing a particular problem.
Yes, I mean, one of the things we showed in our, Carl, who's sitting over there, did a nice report on this, that if you take out the 50 to 64s, actually more women are in the workforce than before. The inactivity problem is startlingly male-focused among under 50s, and no one seems to be quite sure why it is. But Amanda, what's your...
I was just going to add what our insight is since the announcements, because of what our clients have been asking. And I think there is a bit of mistrust that this is going to last because of what Labour have been saying. So that is influencing on pensions, yes, in terms of returning to work. So do you want to return to work and top up your pension only for the lifetime allowance to be brought back in again, and what does that do? So that's been a question. But sort of what else would you do? I love the idea of the returnerships and flexible working. I think you're absolutely right on that. There is something I think they could look at on a tax cliff edge, which is this £100,000 earning threshold. As soon as you reach £100,000, you start losing your personal allowance and your childcare. And I think this is definitely, in our environment, at least in Deloitte, something that people consider when they go over that 100,000 threshold. So some research into that would be welcomed.
The worst aspect of the UK tax system, and the one which is least likely to get any political sympathy whatsoever from the mass of the British public.
I'm only here because my chief executive is on maternity leave. So, in a sense, I'm the person that this childcare package is designed to affect, because when she comes back to work, I can stop working, and you won't have to put up with me. But I think both the last two speakers have really drawn attention to the fact that the package could be a lot bigger. There's a lot more to be done. You sense that the people in Whitehall had actually sharpened their pencils a bit and started to get to work on this. And their first utterances weren't entirely brilliant. They're quite expensive, and there's a lot of deadweight cost. But I think there's a lot more that can be done. I suspect we'll also, sadly and toughly, have to deal with getting the right incentives to work from the benefit system as well. And that may be complicated. But I think all these things will have to come together.
Thank you. There's an awful lot of things I could ask, but we've got people in the audience who presumably want to ask questions, and it's probably much better to hear from you. In the process of which I will, I'm afraid, lose my mic, so I will just be doing quite a lot of pointing. But if anyone has any questions, please put your hand up. Otherwise, I can just vamp. No, the two gentlemen at the back. I feel bereft now.
Hi, regarding corporation tax, after 4 days of intensive research in Dublin, it appears there's a direct correlation between low rates of corporation tax and success in the rugby pitch. Would the panel agree?
Not sure what to say about that one, but well done, Ireland.
I would point out that the French are doing quite well, and I'm not sure they're renowned for their low tax environment.
I'm part English, part Irish, so I was hedged.
And my only comment is that it depends whether you use the low rate of corporation tax to affect the refereeing decisions.
Oh, better. The Barcelona strategy, is it now?
Hi there, it's Joe Mays from Bloomberg. Just a question for Richard. Could you talk us through how you scored the full expensing policy and why it was the case that it provides growth in the first 3 years seemingly, but then doesn't in years 4 and 5, and is seen as a negative at the end of the forecast period? And just secondly, related to that, a question for all the panel, perhaps Kitty could start on this, which is, do you think the 5-year fiscal period is the best way to approach a budget in terms of long-term economic growth and the best interests of the country, or is there some alternative framework we could be using which would have better outcomes?
So on how we look at the impact of the I suppose both the CT rise and the investment allowance together, since the rise in corporation tax from 18% to 25% was announced a while ago, I think 18 months ago, if memory serves, that's acted as a drag on investment in our forecast because it reduces the post-tax return on investment. So we've always had around 0.2 taken off our potential output forecast in the long run from that tax rise. What the capital allowance measure does is it provides a temporary incentive to boost investment. So for the 3 years in which the capital allowance measure is in place, you get an extra around just over 3% more investment in those 3 years than you would otherwise have had the capital allowance not been in place, on top of that drag that you're getting from the higher baseline rate of corporation tax. But because that then expires after 3 years and then you get the full effect of the CT rise, you then get lower investment over the remainder of the forecast, because what in effect happens is you get investment in the long run. The effect of the allowances is zero because you basically just face the full effect of the corporation tax measure. What the capital allowance measure does is create an incentive to bring forward future investment into the period where you can get the tax advantage. So it drags investment forward from the future into those 3 years. But in the long run, you're just facing the post-tax return on capital that you get once the CT rate goes up. And if you take sort of cumulative investment from last year to the end of our forecast period, it is largely unchanged from what you saw before the measure was introduced. You just bring forward some of that investment from future years into the 3 years in which you get the tax benefit.
When Jeremy Hunt said he couldn't do it in years 4 and 5 because he couldn't afford it, because he couldn't afford it in year 4, but you're saying that it would have provided growth in years 4 and 5 as well. So what did the Chancellor mean by he couldn't afford it in years 4 and 5?
Well, he wouldn't have gotten the tax. He wouldn't have got the tax revenue.
The growth effect would have been.
You would have had a growth effect, but at least in the near term, the lost revenue would have offset the growth effect. So if you'd had full expensing for 5 years, that would have cost you around £10 billion net in that final year. And when you've only got £6.5 billion before debt starts to rise again, that makes that difficult.
And on the 5-year, the 5-year horizon, that's something you can't.
So had you done a 5-year full expensing?
No. The wider question about 5 years as is it a sensible way to be doing?
That's a matter for chancellors. We just kind of mark the test they set for themselves. We produce a 5-year forecast, although we'd also produce a 50-year forecast if somebody wanted to use them. In both traditionally in British politics as well as internationally, when people set fiscal targets, they tend to set them over a period of 3 to 5 years. And that's because they either coincide with our forecast horizon or they coincide with the period of a parliament. So they sort of coincide with the political cycle. I guess in the past it's been seen as odd to set yourself fiscal targets over 10 years because you may be setting fiscal targets for the next government rather than for your own. But it's worth bearing in mind he had a target that had a 3-year horizon up until November, and then he pushed out the deadline to 5 years because he wasn't going to meet his target in 3 years' time. So he bought himself a bit more time and space by pushing it back 2 years, but he's still only just meeting it.
Yeah, on that point, personally, I think a 5-year target is quite a weak target. So if you're interested in sustainability of public finances, you would say it should be more near term than that, I would say. Markets seem to be relatively relaxed, that it was just about pointing downwards at the end of that 5-year period. We know what happens when you can't produce such a graph. We saw that last year. So I'm conscious it's weak, and I worry slightly as a kind of economist about the fact that it's weak. Having said that, I suppose if it's always met, then the market's always okay, so they'll always be able to raise debt. So, it doesn't go up as a proportion of GDP, it just sort of stays flattish. So maybe we don't worry too much. I think, as I said before, it makes no sense to unwind the capital expensing policy, because presumably, unless I've misunderstood something, once you get into steady state, it's not costing you anything because it's a phasing of government receipts. And so, but do come back if I've got that wrong.
There's a limited cost from the long-term cost, but it's kind of it's pretty low. It's it's the vast bulk of the cost is the first couple of years. But I mean, this is why it does seem insane. Like everyone has said, it's insane to do this. Labour have said we like this, we will keep it. I mean, it does seem to be the accounting rules that are stopping this rather than actual economic sense. But
the only thing I'd say, just on you mentioning the accounting rules, of course, I was surprised it was costed so highly, actually, because at the end of the day, it is a cash benefit rather than an absolute giveaway. Unlike R&D credits, where you actually get money from the government, or the super deduction, which was a top-up to the capital allowance, this is just allowing you to deduct your capital expenditure in the same year you incur it, simply. So so we did a sort of day after the budget webinar with clients, and many, and this is across Europe, they're based all over the place, said it's not going to impact my ETR. My effective tax rate is still going to be the same because of the accounting adjustments with deferred tax. So I think it's just quite interesting, the judgment call as to how much this will stimulate new investment. No doubt business values having that cash advantage, especially at the moment, but actually other benefits that stimulate investment could be explored as well, I think, in future.
So the lady at the front and then the gentleman in front of her.
Thank you. Noah Cohen from the CBI. It feels like businesses have been banging on about the need for apprenticeship levy reform for years now, and yet we've still not seen anything more than just tinkering around the edges. Do you think it's feasible that it will happen before the next election? And also, what's your assessment on its impact on growth?
Well, CBL has done quite a lot of work on apprenticeship, and I've also been personally involved in setting up the degree apprenticeship for economists. So I've seen the system operate at first hand. Now, they give me two entirely contradictory views on the subject, you'll be pleased to hear. The view that's positive is that most of our analysis shows the returns to apprenticeship are huge. And both at an individual level and at a societal level, the returns are really massive, which makes it a policy that's worthwhile pursuing. On the other hand, when I actually got involved in setting up an apprenticeship scheme, it turned out to be so hamstrung with restrictions and things that ultimately we, having helped set the thing up and having invested a lot of our time in setting it up, decided that we didn't want to participate. Now, I imagine that most other employers will think the same way. So I think what you need to do is find a scheme that really minimises the restraints on what employers can do. It's really complicated for the Treasury because what they're trying to do is hand out government money and make sure no one steals it. And the problem is, if you make it too difficult to steal the money, you also make it too difficult to access the money legally. And that's where I think the problem comes.
Yeah. And the same dynamic, by the way, the same dynamic with the full expensing stuff. We've said the Treasury sets the rules because it's always.
So the more flexibilities that you have, the better it will be. However, there is a sort of mindset in this that means that apprenticeships are sort of crowding out the whole of the sort of training debate. And it may be that there are, other things that businesses should be doing anyway, and other policies that should be incentivizing them to invest in skills shortage areas, for example, like a tax credit to train in a skills shortage area. We've got a list of skills shortage areas because it's the boot camp list and the lifelong learning guarantee list. So why not sort of get the whole economy to be investing in training people in those areas, for example. The other thing that sort of keeps sticking in my mind is how much money is returned to the Treasury from the apprenticeship scheme, even when there are all these ways of spreading it through the supply chain through to smaller businesses. So it feels like a brilliant scheme, but sort of clunky and almost too big. But when you say that to the Treasury, they say, well, we want it to get bigger, so we're not going to constrain it or change it in any way because we want more of these things.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Alberto Portuguese, and I lived in this country for 57 years. And every year since I came here, I hear all the same problems discussed, and all the same crises every time, promises and promises and promises. I would like to know what the panel thinks of this idea. If we stopped financing the war industry, and if we stop financing wars the world over, not only us, but other countries as well, we would avoid all these crises that we discussed today and that we see in the papers all the time, whether it is education, health, the environment, everything. They're always short of money here, short of money there, always. But to buy another air fighter or warship, there is always the money, and to finance our.
I think we understand. Yeah. And Vincent, sorry, and the gentleman there.
Thank you. Andy Sellers from the Compound Semiconductor Applications Catapult. In the budget, there was £2.5 billion for quantum technology and I think £800 million for artificial intelligence. So I'm just wondering what the panel's view is. Has the Chancellor done enough to make the UK a science superpower?
So science superpowers and peace on earth. Who wants to take either of those aspects?
I think I could do peace on earth, which is I think we all very much share your sentiment that it's hard to find in the long run productive things to do with equipment designed to destroy things and people. Although one should say from the point of view what costs government money these days, one of the things which previous governments have relied on over the course of the last 2 decades has been the fact that we've actually been spending much less on defence than we used to. Governments used to spend more than twice as much as a share of GDP on defence. And that's actually given both the British government and governments across the advanced world a bit of a peace dividend. Certainly since the end of the Cold War, where we used to spend about 4% of GDP or more on defence, it then fell down to around 2% of GDP more recently. That actually gave governments more options to spend on things like expanding childcare, on expanding healthcare, on expanding other aspects of the peacetime welfare state. And I think one of the challenges that governments now face is that there are actually more people lobbying them in the other direction, which is to spend more money on defence. And there was actually, alongside this budget, a commitment to actually increase defence spending in the UK from where it is now, which is 2%, up to 2.5%. And that is one of these things which is adding upward pressure on public spending and on the size of state, alongside the fact that it is also expanding its welfare offer in areas like childcare and also paying a lot more money to service its debts. So I think while lots of people would share your sentiments, sadly, a lot of the pressures on chancellors and their decision making seems to be going in the other direction.
And on a scientific superpower, also throwing in the US Inflation Reduction Act and the tens/hundreds of billions of pounds in subsidies that are being thrown at these sectors in our competitors.
Well, shall I pick up the science superpower, because I'm not very good at peace on Earth. Having been the chief economist for IBM in the UK and having written about the flat white economy, which is our attempt at being a science superpower, the amount of money that's been put in is enough to do an economic study on science superpowers. And maybe that's a really good use of it, because CBR claims to be in the forefront of research into the economic impact of science. So maybe with a bit of luck, that's what the money will do. It's not going to make much difference. You don't buy a hell of a lot of labs for the sort of money that you're talking about. Inflation Reduction Act. Everyone tells me this is a big thing and we need to match it. I think it is a big thing in financial terms. Whether that means we should try and do exactly the same, I wonder. I'm not totally convinced that we can outspend the US, and I think given the extent of the protectionism built in, that may not necessarily be the appropriate strategy.
I would agree with you, Doug. I think so. The 369 billion that is scored for the Inflation Reduction Act is probably underestimated. It's going to be more than that because there are no limits on some of the adjustments. It is also, there's also the Chips and Science Act, which they have introduced as well, which you probably know. So I think that we cannot possibly spend, you know, half a trillion on subsidising our industry. It could be a really good thing what the US is doing in terms of incentivising green energy changes for the world, but we are going to have to select our bets, and we saw some evidence of that in this budget, talking about carbon capture, specific AI, for instance. So maybe they're doing that. They are shoring up the film industry a bit more because that's been a real success, and the tax systems helped create that. So I think, is it enough? Probably not, but I think with the combination of catapults, free ports and investment zones, it's a good start. It's just the numbers are quite small.
Thanks. Just a couple of very sort of additional small reflections. I think the government knows that it can't spend any more in order to try and have its own IRA. Rather depressing situation to be in. No one's really talking about Britain, given the extent of the American intervention and the fact that the EU is moving quite fast in its policy response as well. I sense that there's a move towards trying to use the city to become a global expert place for green financing instead, because obviously that's a private sector solution and goes with the grain of some of the recent policy announcements like the Edinburgh reforms around sort of freeing up assets, pension assets in particular, to invest in the real economy. So I'm expecting those two will start to come together a little bit more. The another slight reflection, I've absolutely no idea if there's enough being spent to become a science superpower. I wouldn't be able to quantify that, but I do notice that there is a increasing rhetoric on sort of a sectoral approach. So it's not picking winners in terms of firms, but it seems to be picking winners in terms of areas of the economy where we may have a comparative advantage, which might make a lot of sense. But I just sort of point out that, you know, we need the more foundational economy, the more traditional economy also to have a step change in terms of its productivity in order to have an overall macroeconomic impact. Which is why I worry about things like the R&D tax credit being very focused.
Maybe I'm just not very good at using these things. So I mean, we've got time for one last question. Well, Philip, did you want to ask, or Robert behind you?
It's a very quick question.
Okay, well, in that case, if you take a quick question for Philip, and then hopefully a quick question for Robert, and then
when you think of a question, obviously somebody addressed it. Amanda, you addressed it very briefly under development zones. My question is 80 million over 5 years for the development zones, 12 zones, and Jeremy Hunt talking about New Canary Wharfs. I mean, Canary Wharf was an overarching sort of monolithic development corporation that swept aside everything in its path to achieve something. Are we really talking about development zones in these development areas and development corporations ruling them, or is this just a slip of journalism?
Thanks. Robert McElwain from Mineral Products Association. I just want to pick up on Amanda's comments on carbon capture, because 20 billion over 20 years sounds great, but at the same time Treasury is making a lot of decisions on a very short-term basis, so the HS2 changes go in exactly the opposite direction of sort of long-term. It's going to be a really long-term project, and also making really slow progress on a lot of other really key policy areas like a carbon border adjustment mechanism, where we're potentially going to get absolutely mullered by dumping in a few years' time.
So, in short, I agree with you. 80 million over 5 years is a very low number. It's not getting people particularly excited. What is exciting about it, I think, is the degree of tax or fiscal decentralisation that's going on. So the idea that there are local decision makers, whether they're mayoral, regions, councils, that will be able to determine a sort of split of grants and centrally provided tax release, I think is the most interesting thing about what's going on with investment zones, actually, and that's something for us all to watch. I would say on the carbon capture point, you're right, spreading it over such a long period of time is just, we'll be in a different phase of technology in 20 years' time completely, in my view. But I think what's really interesting is ambition and big numbers does get people interested, and then hopefully the level of grants will support some commercial activity. And on your CBAM point, you're right, we were expecting a consultation to be announced on that because the EU has decided to implement. I don't know that we'll necessarily suffer with dumping of bad technology, though, because the way it's going to work is through sort of valuing the ETS or the other ways that we're pricing carbon, including duties. So I'd hope that they will follow what the EU have done, even though that may not be palatable, by the time they've tested the CBAM mechanism.
Thanks. Unless anyone else has any strong thoughts on that, I'm just going to ask, we're right at the end, so I'm going to ask our panel in the classic cliched fashion to sum up, ideally in one sentence, what they make of the reaction to the budget, politically, what it's changed, where it leaves us as a country. Why not just going from left to right? Not perhaps politically as well, but certainly in terms of my.
No comment. So I think we've got political consensus pretty much on the need to focus on business investment, which is encouraging. If this is just a politics question, that's probably the most notable thing that's happened, I would say, in the last couple of weeks.
I would say it was a brighter outlook than what we expected in November, but one where there are still a lot of challenges and risks lurking on the horizon. I mean, I should say, in terms of looking at the package of policies, in terms of the effect of fiscal policies, this was the single largest supply-side effect that we, as an organisation, have reflected in our forecast from a specific set of measures. Now, we've only been around for 10 years, so we didn't score Margaret Thatcher or Nigel Lawson's budgets of the 1980s, but in terms of what you've seen in terms of policies trying to make a meaningful difference to a set of supply-side challenges in the UK. They did make a meaningful difference, but they also underscore just how tough tackling these problems are and how long it can take to make a meaningful difference.
I would sum it up as having some positive statements, as Kitty says, on business investment, but the fact is that we are now in an unprecedented period of high tax burden, and it's probably here to stay.
I wish I could end on a brighter note, but I still think we've got a problem of how to get the economy growing. And if we don't get the economy growing, we've got a problem of how to finance even the level of public services that we've got, let alone those that we would want.